Stories about justice begin with rules, with laws carved into stone, with a judge who speaks and everyone else obeys. But this story begins with silence, the kind of silence that fills a courtroom when something unexpected is about to happen. Judge Margaret Harrison was known as the Steel Gavel. For 23 years, she handed down sentences without hesitation, her voice carrying the weight of unshakable authority. To prosecutors, she was reliable. To defense lawyers, she was unbreakable. And to defendants, especially young black men who had grown up on the wrong side of the system, she was a wall that never moved. Yet on one October morning, as the sunlight poured through tall windows and shadows stretched across the polished benches, everything shifted. Because before her stood David Williams, a black man condemned to die that very evening. He didn't ask for mercy. He didn't beg for time. Instead, he asked for something so simple, so human, that it made the entire courtroom lean forward and hold its breath. And in that moment, the toughest judge in America realized she was about to face the greatest test of her life. Could justice mean more than punishment? Could compassion break through the steel she had built around her heart? This is not just a courtroom story. It is a story about race, mercy, and the fragile line between the law we enforce and the humanity we often forget. For most people, a courtroom is a place you only see in flashes on the news, in a headline, in a scene from a movie where the judge lowers her eyes and the gavel comes down like thunder. But for Judge Margaret Harrison, this room of polished wood and tall windows had been home for 23 years. The nickname, the Steel Gavel, didn't arrive all at once. It was forged case by case, ruling by ruling, until it clung to her like the faint scent of varnish in these benches impossible to miss, harder still to wash away. She believed in order. She believed in rules. She believed that if you hold the line long enough, the chaos of human failure will not spill over the edges and drown the rest of us. Prosecutors loved her for that. Defense attorneys learned to read the tight line of her mouth and understood exactly how little room there was to move. And for a long time, Margaret told herself that this is what justice looked like. Firm, measured, consistent. Yet there is a truth no robe can hide. When we mistake consistency for wisdom, we risk hardening into stone. And when stone meets a living, breathing human being, the person cracks first. In the early years, Margaret would go home late and place her father's picture on the kitchen table while the kettle hissed, and she'd talk to him in the space between the clatter of cups. "Dad, I did the right thing, didn't I?" But over time, the ritual faded. The questions faded. The gavel remained. Then came a morning in October, the kind that pours sunlight like warm water over the paneled walls and makes dust sparkle as if the air itself were trying to speak. Court officers shifted in their shoes. Families whispered. And a man was led in with chains clasping his wrists. His name was David Williams. The file would tell you he was 32, convicted of second-degree murder, execution scheduled for that evening at 8. It would list dates and motions and denials, and if you stacked the pages on the defense table, they would stand a finger thick, thin enough to ignore, heavy enough to crush. But the file did not say that David learned to keep his hands visible when he was 12, because officers in his neighborhood flexed their power like a casual habit. It did not say that store clerks watched him longer than they watched the aisles. It did not say that teachers who praised his essays still steered him quietly away from the advanced track, because they did not see a future in the boy they praised. The file made a shape of him, but it did not make him. If you have ever been judged before, you could explain yourself. You know the fatigue David carried. Think about the workplace where one person's mistake becomes a little slip and another person's mistake becomes a pattern. Think about the classroom where a kid learns that excellence buys him the right to be tolerated, not the dignity of being seen. Think about all the times the benefit of the doubt was handed out like a warm coat and somehow skipped the person who needed it most. Systemic bias is not a headline, it is the accumulation of small decisions, small looks, small fears, until one day the scale tips and a life slides off the edge. When David sat at the defendant's table, shackles bright against the wood, he didn't stare Margaret down, and he didn't look away. He looked through the glass of her authority to search for something inside her she hadn't offered in years. Room. Not mercy that erased wrong, not sentimentality that tried to repaint the past, but room for the whole human to stand in front of her and still be recognized as human. Margaret felt it the way you feel a storm rolling in from a distance. The pressure drops before the rain begins. She'd spent decades telling herself that the law did not require her to weigh the weather outside the window, race, class, fear only the facts on the page. But facts do not live in the airless vault of logic. They arrive carried by bodies and histories. The truth is that a judge's bench is not just a piece of furniture. It is a balcony over a country still learning how to see. And when the person standing below that balcony is a black man, history climbs the steps with him whether we invite it or not. Here's a real-life thing to hold in your hands while we talk about Margaret and David. Imagine two teenagers caught shoplifting the same small item on the same day in the same mall. One is white, one is black. The white teen gets a call from his parents, a warning, maybe an officer's speech about responsibility. The black teen gets escorted to a room, questioned longer, and maybe a charge sticks. Now press fast forward a few years. The white teen knows he got a scare. The black teen knows the world can take his name and nail it to a file. The next time they both make a mistake, one carries a story about himself that bends toward redemption, the other carries a story that bends toward guilt. These aren't one-offs. They're grooves worn into the floor we all have to walk. And so the small things become the big things, and the big things become sentences read aloud in rooms like this one. If Margaret was honest and the sunlight gave her nowhere to hide, she had felt this difference and stepped around it, as if empathy were a puddle she could simply avoid to keep her shoes dry. She didn't hate. She didn't sneer. She just kept the machine running, believing that neutrality is the same as fairness. It isn't. Neutrality in a skewed system is a slow permission slip for the skew to continue. The lesson here is not to throw away rules, it is to measure whether the rules are doing what we say they do. Strength without listening becomes fear, and fear is efficient. It closes cases faster than compassion ever could. But strength with listening becomes respect, and respect does not undo consequences, it illuminates them. As the clerk announced the case and the bailiff called for all to rise, Margaret felt the room incline toward the predictable. She could have traveled the old map with her eyes closed, confirm the verdict, cite the statute, close the file. But when David stood, the chain at his waist chimed against the table, and he reached into his pocket for a small, worn photograph. Something in her chest shifted. A father's hand, a child's birthday dress. The edges are gone soft from being held too many times in a cell where nothing else stays warm. David did not speak then, that would come later, but the picture spoke for him. I am not only the worst thing I did, I am also the best thing I love. There is a current that runs under every courtroom script, and it isn't just the drama of witnesses and cross-exams. It is the simple, radical possibility that we could look at a person and refuse to let the system's stereotypes be the only light by which we see. Margaret had once studied that possibility. Somewhere between the early mornings when she read case law with a highlighter and the late nights when she believed she could improve the world by following every rule, she had believed it passionately. Then the docket thickened, the years layered, the politics sharpened, and the possibility dulled into policy. Today, that possibility pulled its chair back up to her bench. She thought of her father again, not a saint, not a slogan, just a man who had once been stopped on the highway 3 towns over from where he worked and asked to explain why a black man was driving a nice car at night. He told the story to Margaret gently, as if laying a hand on her shoulder, not to make her angry but to keep her awake. "Don't sleep through what's true," he'd said. "The truth is this: punishment without understanding teaches obedience, but not growth. Understanding without accountability teaches indulgence, but not safety. Justice is the hard, daily work of holding both, so that the person who harmed and the community that was harmed can step back into the world less likely to break again." And that is why this morning mattered. Not because rules were about to be ignored, but because the reason the rules exist was about to be asked out loud. If you're listening to this and wondering how it applies to your life, try this. The next time you feel the snap of judgment in your chest, pause and ask what story you've been handed about the person in front of you. Ask who wrote it. Ask who benefits if you never rewrite it. Then measure your strength not by how hard you come down, but by how much room you can make for truth without dropping the line you must hold. In that courtroom, as the sun inched along the floorboards and the murmurs faded to a taut hush, Margaret realized she was not just presiding over a case. She was standing at the hinge of a door she had closed on herself. On one side lay the comfort of certainty, on the other, the risk of seeing fully. The gavel in her hand felt heavier than it had in years. And that is where this begins, not with shouting, but with stillness. not with a sweeping speech, but with a small photo held in a father's trembling hand. Because sometimes the first mercy is not something you give, it is something you allow yourself to see. In a moment, the voices will rise, the arguments will clash, and the room will tilt toward a decision that will be praised as courage and condemned as weakness. But before any of that, there is this breath, this pause, this light across the wood, and a judge who may finally be ready to hear what justice sounds like when it remembers to be human. And as David lifts his eyes to meet hers, the story moves out of the shadow of a nickname and into the bright, unflinching place where a condemned man will ask for his last small request, and the steel gavel will have to decide whether law alone is enough to answer it. The scrape of metal against wood echoed as David Williams shifted in his seat, shackles pulling tight around his wrists. To most in the courtroom, he was nothing more than another convicted man, another headline that had already been written, another face in an orange jumpsuit. But if you looked closely, as Judge Harrison did in Stolen Glances, you could see something deeper dignity in the way he sat, a strange calm in the way he lifted his eyes to meet the world's. He did not fidget. He did not curse under his breath. He carried himself with a quietness that unsettled the people who expected him to rage. The file was clear. 32 years old, convicted of second-degree murder, sentenced to die by lethal injection. The execution date had bounced through appeals, delays, paperwork backlogs, but finally, the system had aligned against him, and tonight at 8 o'clock, the process would end with clinical precision. But a file could never explain why a man's shoulders carried so much weight even while sitting still. A file did not tell of childhood nights spent listening to gunshots down the street, of police officers who frisked him at 14 while he still smelled of chalk from the basketball court, but of classmates who disappeared into jail cells before they had a chance to earn diplomas. When David was young, his mother pressed coins into his hand for groceries, and he walked to the store under the watchful gaze of men who called him boy with a sneer heavy enough to crush him. He had grown up in a neighborhood where you learned to keep your hands visible at all times because officers didn't always ask questions before reaching for their belts. Survival was not about flourishing. It was about dodging the assumptions that could kill you. Now, in the courtroom, those same assumptions hung thick in the air. For years, Margaret had watched defendants like David shuffle into her courtroom, and she had convinced herself that justice was colorblind. But the truth? Statistics whispered otherwise. Black defendants received harsher sentences than white ones, particularly in capital cases when the victims were white. David's victim had been a young white man. The unspoken weight of that fact bent the scales long before today's gavel. As he sat there, David thought not of statistics but of Amelia. He pulled the worn photograph from his pocket whenever guards allowed it. The edges had gone soft from fingers tracing them over and over. A little black girl with curly hair and ribbons in her dress smiled at him from 2 years ago, frozen in time. She was 7 now, living without him, asking questions he could not answer. Where's Daddy? Why can't he come home? Her mother, protective and proud, had cut ties after the conviction, and David did not blame her, but he prayed every night in that cell that Amelia would not grow up believing she had been abandoned. When Sarah Chen, his public defender, leaned toward him and whispered, "Now is your chance," David stood. The clatter of shackles silenced even the rustle of reporters' pens. He lifted the photograph carefully, holding it so everyone could see. His voice was steady, but each word carried the weight of chains. "Your Honor, this is my daughter Amelia. She was 5 in this picture. I haven't seen her since that day." His voice cracked, then steadied again. "I know tonight is the end. I accept it. I don't ask for mercy. I don't ask for a delay. All I ask is to leave her something. A message. Something that tells her she was loved by her father, even in my last hours." The courtroom inhaled as one. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, her throat constrict. In all her years, she had heard pleas for clemency, cries of innocence, angry denials. But never this. A man ready to die asking not for himself, but for his child. And here lies the lesson. Even in a system that strips men down to numbers and files, humanity still rises. A father's love cannot be shackled, cannot be executed, cannot be filed away in evidence boxes. The prosecutor stiffened, sensing trouble. Reporters leaned forward, smelling a story larger than any verdict. And Margaret's steel-gavelled Margaret felt something shift inside her. For the first time in years, she saw not a defendant, but a father. And with that shift came danger. Because if she saw him as a father, she had to admit what the system had done. It had treated him like less than human. That truth pressed against her chest, heavy, undeniable, and it would not let her go. The silence held like a taut rope ready to snap. And when it did, it would split the courtroom in two. Those who believed justice must be unyielding, and those who believed justice without mercy was no justice at all. The room was frozen in the aftershock of David's words when movement came from the gallery. A woman pushed herself to her feet, her hands gripping the wooden rail for balance. Gasps rippled through the audience as they recognized her, Mrs. Patterson, mother of the victim. For years, she had been the silent presence in the courtroom, her grief etched in the lines of her face, her eyes fixed on the man who had taken her son. She had spoken to reporters only in brief phrases. "We just want justice." She had carried herself with quiet rage, her shoulders bowed but unbroken. But today, as David held up the photograph of Amelia, something stirred in her that no one expected. "Your Honor," she said softly, her voice trembling yet clear. "May I speak?" Every rule told Margaret to deny the request. Victim impact statements came at sentencing, not in the middle of a final hearing. But this was no ordinary day. She nodded, giving permission. Mrs. Patterson's voice filled the hush. "My son Michael was 22 when he died. He had just graduated from college. He was planning to propose to his girlfriend." Her voice cracked, but she steadied herself. "I have sat through every hearing. I have watched this man, and I have seen something I never thought I would. Remorse. Not the kind that comes from being caught, but the kind that comes from knowing the depth of what you've taken." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Some faces hardened in anger, others softened in surprise. This was not the script. A grieving mother was supposed to demand blood, not acknowledge humanity in the man who had taken her child. Mrs. Patterson turned toward David. Her eyes glistened, but her voice held firm. "My son was a father, too. He had a little girl, only 3. She will grow up without him, asking questions I can never answer. I tell her stories. I show her pictures. I play videos. That is all she has. And when I look at you holding that photograph, I see a father who wants to leave his daughter the same thing, a story, a memory, a truth that love existed, even in the darkest place." The murmurs swelled into whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously. Prosecutor Chen's jaw tightened, his knuckles white around his file. He saw the courtroom narrative slipping away. Compassion was spreading like wildfire, and compassion was dangerous because it could set a precedent. Here lies another lesson. Racism thrives on dehumanization. It survives when people believe that some lives are beyond redemption, some fathers are incapable of love, and some communities are undeserving of compassion. But when a grieving white mother looked at a black man condemned to die and saw a father instead of a monster, she shattered that lie. Think of the times in your life when you finally saw someone differently after hearing their story. A coworker you misjudged until you learned about their burdens. A neighbor you avoided until you understood their scars. Stories break stereotypes, and Mrs. Patterson's words broke them wide open. She lowered her head, her shoulders shaking, and returned to her seat. The air in the courtroom was thick, heavy, charged with a power that no statute book could contain. Margaret felt her own hands tremble. For 23 years, she had defined herself by unflinching rules, but now she was watching rules bend under the weight of love and grief, and she wondered, had she been wrong all along? The silence that followed was deafening. The gavel was heavy in her hand, and she knew that whatever happened next, the world beyond these windows would not be the same. The air in the courtroom was brittle, like glass about to shatter. Mrs. Patterson's words still echoed, their compassion rattling the rigid framework of the trial. But District Attorney Robert Chen was not a man to let silence linger. He shot up from his seat, suit jacket flaring, voice slicing through the room like a blade. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." His words snapped across the benches, crisp and rehearsed. "The state has followed every procedure, every ruling, every appeal. The execution is scheduled, authorized, and affirmed. To indulge this request," he gestured sharply toward David, "is to undermine the authority of this court and the integrity of our system of justice." He paused, letting his words settle like a challenge. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously. The gallery erupted into low whispers, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Sarah Chen rose slowly, her presence calmer but no less commanding. She adjusted her glasses, let the weight of silence tip back in her favor, and spoke with measured conviction. Your Honor, my client is not asking for clemency. He is not asking for release, or for a delay, or for mercy that would change the course of the law. He asks only for a chance to leave his daughter a message. 30 minutes. Supervised. Contained. No delay in the execution. Justice will be carried out as ordered, but with humanity intact. Her words carried a rhythm, steady and resolute, designed not just to appeal to Margaret, but to echo in the ears of every person listening inside the courtroom and outside, where the story would ripple. The clash between Robert and Sarah became more than a legal argument. It was a collision of two worldviews. For Robert, justice was rigid, a machine powered by precedent and procedure, one that could not afford compassion because compassion was unpredictable, messy, uncontrollable. For Sarah, justice was alive, breathing, incomplete without acknowledging the human beings at its center. Margaret listened, her gaze flicking from one to the other. She knew Robert's position. It was the same one she had lived by for decades. But Sarah's voice pried at the cracks forming in her armor. The world was watching, and so was history. Robert leaned forward, his voice rising. If we allow this, what next? Every defendant will claim extraordinary circumstances. The law will bend and bend until it breaks. This is not about humanity. This is about discipline, and discipline requires hard lines. Sarah countered without flinching. Discipline without humanity is not justice. It's cruelty in disguise. My client is a father. That truth is not erased by his crime. The court has the authority to grant this request without compromising the law. And the question we must ask ourselves is simple. Are we afraid of compassion, or are we afraid of what compassion reveals about the system we serve? The words landed like a blow. The gallery buzzed louder. Some spectators shifted uneasily, torn between admiration and outrage. Racism's shadow loomed large, unspoken but present. Would a white defendant's request for a final message to his daughter have provoked such fury? Would Robert be so quick to cry dangerous precedent if the condemned man looked like him? Margaret felt the unspoken question press down on her shoulders. She had always prided herself on impartiality. But impartiality in a system tilted by bias is not fairness, it's complicity. The lesson here is sharp. When law is applied without context, it disguises inequality as order. And when compassion is denied, it is often denied first to those already marginalized. The tension mounted until the room felt suffocating. David remained silent, still clutching his photograph, his dignity louder than any argument. He knew the fight wasn't his to wage, it was between the voices of the system, but his presence was the proof of what was at stake. A black man condemned, yet still undeniably human. Margaret leaned forward, her voice breaking the clash like thunder. Enough. The single word silenced the room. This is not a debate club. This is my courtroom, and it is my decision. The clash of laws and humanity had reached its crescendo. And now the gavel hovered, ready to determine not just one man's fate, but the meaning of justice in a fractured system. Margaret's heart pounded, each beat like a drum announcing the gravity of what was about to unfold. For 23 years, she had built her career on predictability. Prosecutors respected her because they always knew where she stood. Defendants feared her for the same reason. But now, for the first time, she stood on the precipice of uncertainty. Her eyes scanned the room, the prosecutors, tense and unyielding, the defense, desperate but hopeful. Mrs. Patterson, pale and trembling yet resolute. David, still holding the photograph like it was a lifeline. Beyond them all, the gallery, the press, the weight of the nation's gaze, pressing in through the tall windows. She drew in a breath. "Mr. Williams," she began, her voice carrying the authority of decades but softened by something new. "Your request is extraordinary. In my 23 years, I have never encountered a situation like this. The law is clear. The schedule is set. The sentence will be carried out tonight at 8 o'clock as ordered." She paused, letting the familiar rhythm of her judgment establish its grip. Then she broke it. But justice is not only about punishment, it is also about humanity. And humanity demands that we recognize the bonds that even prison cannot sever. Therefore, this court grants your request. You will have 30 minutes to record a message for your daughter under strict supervision at the correctional facility. There will be no delay in the execution." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, the frantic scratching of pens. The press gallery flared alive, cameras clicking. Some in the audience clapped their hands over their mouths in shock. Others whispered furiously about weakness, about softness. Robert slammed his hand onto the table, his fury barely contained. Sarah closed her eyes in relief, tears spilling down her cheeks. David's composure cracked at last. Tears streamed freely as he whispered, "Thank you, Your Honor," his voice breaking, a father's gratitude wrapped in sorrow. He sank back into his seat, clutching the photograph with trembling hands. Margaret raised her gavel and brought it down hard. The sound reverberated like a thunderclap. "Order! This court will recess until 4 o'clock." Even as the crowd filtered out, murmuring like waves crashing against a cliff, Margaret remained seated. Her robe felt heavier than ever. Her body weighted with the consequences of what she had just done. She had broken from the script, from precedent, from the safety of rigidity, and she knew the storm was coming. Colleagues would condemn her. Politicians would seize her decision as evidence of weakness. Prosecutors would use her as an example of judicial overreach. But none of that mattered now, because she had seen something she could not unsee, the humanity in a condemned black man, and the simple, profound truth that justice without compassion is not justice at all. The lesson here is stark. Courage is not only the refusal to bend, sometimes it is the willingness to bend in the face of scorn. Sometimes it is the choice to recognize that mercy does not erase justice but completes it. As Margaret sat in her chambers, the noise of the courthouse fading into silence, she realized that today would mark her legacy. Not the countless sentences she had handed down with unflinching authority, but this crack in the steel, this decision that shook the court. And as the clock ticked toward 4, the world outside sharpened its gaze, ready to judge the judge who had dared to listen. The sun had shifted by the time the court reconvened. Long shadows stretched across the courtroom floor, painting dark bars of light like prison stripes across the benches. The gavel's echo from earlier still seemed to hang in the air, carrying Margaret's unprecedented decision into every corner of the chamber. All eyes returned to David as guards led him back in, the clink of chains punctuating each step. Something was different about him now. Where earlier he had been calm, restrained, guarded, now his presence carried a kind of release. Peace, perhaps. The knowledge that, for the first time in years, someone had granted him the dignity of being heard. Margaret adjusted her glasses, her voice formal but tinged with a weight she could not disguise. "Mr. Williams, the arrangements have been made. You will be transported to the correctional facility after this hearing. You will have 30 minutes, under full supervision, to record your message for your daughter. This recording will not delay the execution scheduled for this evening. Do you understand?" David's lips parted, his voice catching. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand, and I thank you for giving me the chance to be a father one last time." There was a ripple of murmurs, some sympathetic, others scoffing. The prosecutor sat stiff, his jaw tight as stone. Sarah Chen blinked back tears beside her client, her young face a portrait of hard-won triumph mixed with sorrow. Then the warden, Thompson, stepped forward. A tall man with graying hair, his uniform pressed to perfection, his reputation for discipline carved deep into the walls of the prison he commanded. "Your Honor," he began carefully, "there is one more matter. Mrs. Patterson has requested permission to be present during the recording." The courtroom gasped. Eyes turned to the woman in the cardigan, her grief-lined face steady despite trembling hands. She stood again, voice soft but resolute. "I want to hear what he has to say. Not for him, for my granddaughter. If his daughter deserves this message, then mine deserves it too. To know that even in a world of violence, love can survive." David's head bowed. His hands, cuffed in steel, pressed the photograph against his chest. "It would be an honor," he whispered, voice thick with humility. And so it was settled. Two mothers, divided by tragedy yet bound by motherhood, would share a room with a man condemned, listening as he carved his last words into a record meant to outlive him. At 4 o'clock sharp, the transport was arranged. The correctional facility prepared a plain room, a table, a chair, and a video camera mounted on a tripod. Bright white light spilled down, clinical yet strangely holy, As if the moment demanded clarity, two guards stood like statues at the door. David sat, shackled, with a photograph in his hand. Across from him, Mrs. Patterson folded her arms, a tissue clutched tightly, her shoulders trembling with the effort of composure. The red light blinked on. "Amelia," David began, voice low and unsteady. He cleared his throat, tried again. "My little girl, I don't know when you'll see this, or if you'll even want to, but I need you to know something. Something the world may try to take from you. You were my greatest joy. I failed in so many ways, but I never stopped loving you. Every night I thought of you. Every morning I prayed for you. You are not my crime. You are my hope." The words cracked the air like glass breaking. He lifted the photograph to the camera. "This picture is old. You were 5 here, blowing out candles. You're 7 now. I missed birthdays, first days of school, bedtime stories. I can't give those back. But I can give you this, my voice, telling you I love you. My heart is telling you I believe in you. Don't let anyone tell you you're defined by what your father did. You're defined by who you are." Tears slid down Mrs. Patterson's face. She gripped the tissue so hard it shredded in her palm. For the first time, she saw not the man who killed her son, but a father trying to reach across time and death to his daughter. David continued, his voice gaining strength. "One day, you'll hear things about me, bad things. They'll tell you I was dangerous, that I threw my life away. And they're right, in part. I made choices that hurt people, choices I can never take back. But remember this. Even broken men can love. Even condemned men can pray for their children. That's all I want you to know." The camera light blinked, recording every word. The room held its breath. Guards shifted, uncomfortable, though one brushed a hand across his cheek quickly, pretending it was nothing. When the red light clicked off, silence fell heavy. David bowed his head, chains rattling. "Thank you," he whispered, not to the guards, not even to the camera, but to Amelia, as if she were there. "The lesson is clear. Punishment may silence a body, but mercy gives voice to love. And love, once recorded, can echo across generations." That night, history would note that an execution was carried out on schedule. But what history could not contain was the sound of a father's voice carrying into the future. News does not wait. Before David's transport van even returned to the prison gates, headlines were already flooding feeds. Judge Grant's final wish to condemned black father. Steel gavel shows crack of mercy. Social media exploded. Hashtags trending within minutes. Number justice and mercy. Number Amelia message. Number steel gavel softens. But reactions were split. Some praised Judge Harrison as courageous, a rare beacon of humanity in a system known for coldness. Others condemned her as weak, reckless, and bending the law to emotion. Politicians sharpened their knives, pundits filled panels. The debate raged. Was mercy a betrayal of justice, or was it its fulfillment? Inside the prison, whispers carried among officers. Some scoffed, muttering that rules had been bent for a sob story. Others admitted, in low voices, that they had never seen anything so moving. Hardened guards who had walked men to the chamber dozens of times now found themselves staring at their own hands, wondering what had just passed through them. Outside, protesters gathered. On one side, civil rights activists lifted signs reading, "Stop racist executions," and "Justice includes mercy." They sang, prayed, demanded. On the other hand, counter-protesters held American flags high, chanting, "Law and order," and "No exceptions." The divide was as clear as the color lines etched into American history. David's recording became the spark. Clips leaked to journalists, a man in orange holding a photograph, his voice cracking as he spoke of love. On television screens and phone feeds, millions watched. For some, it was the first time they had seen a condemned black man, not as a statistic, not as a monster, but as a father. And that image, so simple, so undeniable, threatened to rewrite narratives centuries old. Margaret sat alone in her chambers, phone buzzing endlessly with calls from colleagues and reporters. She ignored them all. She thought of her father again, of his gentle warnings, of the way he told her not to sleep through truth. Tonight she had stayed awake, and though the backlash would be fierce, she knew she had chosen the harder path, the one that let her heart guide her hand. The prosecutor, Robert Chen, fumed to cameras outside. This decision undermines discipline. We cannot allow emotional appeals to erode the rule of law. If we do, we invite chaos. His voice was sharp, his stance rigid, but his words sounded brittle compared to the tide swelling online. Sarah Chen spoke more softly but carried farther. Justice is not diminished by compassion, it is strengthened by it. My client died tonight, as the law required, but his daughter will have something no statute could ever provide, her father's love in his own words. That is not a weakness, that is humanity. Here lies the deeper truth. Racism survives not just in the harshness of the law, but in the refusal to let black men be seen as whole, capable of love, of remorse, of humanity. David's final message cracked that refusal open, and once people see what was hidden, it cannot easily be unseen. In the days that followed, churches replayed the clip during sermons. Teachers used it in classrooms, sparking debates among students who had never considered what justice meant beyond punishment. Civil rights leaders pointed to it as proof that the death penalty, disproportionately used against black defendants, was a system infected by bias. And ordinary people, scrolling late at night on their phones, paused at the sight of a father's tears and whispered, "That could have been me. That could have been my brother. That could have been my son." The echoes of mercy stretched far beyond the courtroom walls, and though David's life ended that night, his words lived on, refusing to die. By the time the sky bruised into evening, two crowds faced each other outside the prison gates like mirrors that refused to agree. On one side, hymns rose into the cooling air, voices threading through hand-painted signs, "Justice with mercy, end racist executions." On the other hand, chants beat like drums, "Law and order, no exceptions." The divide wasn't new, it was simply brighter tonight, drawn in hard lines by camera lights and headlines, and a father's trembling voice recorded an hour earlier. Inside, fluorescent corridors hummed a steady, indifferent note. Margaret walked those halls with the quiet of someone who knew how history pressed its thumb into rare moments and kept them there. She didn't enter the chamber. She sat alone in the empty counselor's office across the hall, a clock ticking like a metronome for a song she'd never wanted to conduct. She thought of the doctrine she'd sworn to, of the statistics she had avoided naming aloud, of all the men who had stood exactly where David stood and how many of them shared his skin. The ledger in her mind began to rearrange itself, not to erase accountability, but to allocate sight. When the news came simple, sterile, official, there were no gasps, no theatrics, only a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, released into a room that felt suddenly larger than its walls. She bowed her head, not as a judge, but as a human being who had witnessed love refuse to die on command. Outside, a black mother who had marched every month for a decade turned to her teenage son and said, "You heard him. That's a father." Across the line, a man folded his flag and stared at his shoes, as if the asphalt itself were asking him whether certainty had ever been a luxury he mistook for truth. The reckoning wasn't a verdict. It was a question braided through the night. If justice is blind, why can it still see color so clearly? The answer, whatever it would become, would not arrive in a single law or a single speech. It would arrive the way mornings do, quiet, inevitable, asking us to get up and try again. And as the vans rolled and the crowds thinned, Margaret stepped into the corridor, touching the wood of the doorframe the way one touches a headstone, with respect, with regret, with a promise to carry a name forward. The system had completed its task. The heart had begun its own. The clip traveled faster than commentary could catch it. 15 seconds. A man in orange, a photo in his palm, the word hope tipping his voice into something raw and unmistakable. In churches that Sunday, pastors held the pause after the clip a little longer, letting silence do what argument couldn't. In classrooms, students argued with an urgency that felt new, some defending punishment as the spine of order, others insisting that order without dignity was a masquerade. On late-night TV, a civil rights historian mapped the old road, how capital punishment had so often braided itself with race, how proximity to whiteness shaped outcomes even when the script said otherwise. A former prosecutor surprised himself by admitting, "Sometimes we call it precedent when what we mean is habit." A black public defender described walking her clients through metal detectors that seemed designed not to find weapons but to harvest shame. Meanwhile, A school counselor in a small town cued the clip for a girl named Lila who wouldn't talk about her father in prison. Lila watched, thumb pressed white against her phone's edge, then whispered, "He sounds like my dad." In a kitchen 3 states away, Amelia's mother sat at the table after midnight. The house hushed, the weight of years stacked on her shoulders. She pressed play, and when David said, "You are not my crime," she closed her eyes and let herself believe it for their daughter. The ripples weren't uniform. They never are. Some people dug in, building higher walls around their ideas of safety. Others noticed that the walls had doors. And in a dozen state houses, the clip became an exhibit, sometimes for abolition, sometimes for reform, always for the stubborn insistence that numbers alone cannot carry the weight of a life. Through it all, Margaret refused interviews. She answered one letter, handwritten, from a high school senior who asked what a judge owes a country that is still learning how to be fair. "Clarity," she wrote back, "and the courage to act on it." The student framed the reply above her desk. When she spoke in debate class, her voice did not shake. What moves a nation isn't always a march or a law. Sometimes it is a small, undeniable thing: tears on a father's face, a picture blurred by years of touching, the admission that we can keep people safe without forgetting what makes them people. The clip didn't fix what was broken, it made it harder to pretend we couldn't see it. Years later, sunlight still finds the same angle on Margaret's old bench, and dust still lifts in patient spirals when the doors open. She visits sometimes not as an icon to be debated, but as a woman who once learned late, perhaps, but fully, that steel is only useful when it protects what is living. In her study at home, a single photograph sits beside her father's. A still frame from the recording, David's hand midair, the picture of his daughter between his fingers like a lantern. Amelia grows. She learns to braid her own hair, to set boundaries, and to love without confusing love with permission. On a quiet birthday, her mother places a small drive in her palm. "When you're ready," she says. When Amelia finally presses play, she meets her father's voice not as a ghost but as a bridge. "You are not my crime." She repeats it under her breath once, twice, until it settles where shame used to live. She keeps the last line for herself. Even broken men can love. It doesn't excuse. It explains. An explanation is a kind of light. Mrs. Patterson volunteers at a community center that pairs survivors with men in re-entry. She never calls it forgiveness, she calls it balance. Some days, she cries in the parking lot before walking in. Most days, she walks in anyway. Her granddaughter, all knees and questions, asks why the world is unfair. "Because people forget to see," she says. "So we will keep reminding them." And us, those of us who watched or heard, or only now are catching up, we are left with a practice, not a conclusion. When the moment comes to choose between being right and being whole, we can put the gavel down long enough to listen. We can hold accountability in one hand and possibility in the other. We can admit the oldest truth. Justice that cannot recognize a human face will always miss its mark. The bench, the cell, the camera's red eye, none of them were holy. The holiness was in the choice to see. If there is a legacy worth carrying forward from a day when headlines shouted and crowds divided, it's this. Mercy is not the opposite of justice. Mercy is justice remembering what it is for. And as the credits of this story would roll, if stories like this had credits, we might imagine the camera returning to that first room, sunlight pouring in, a judge holding still, a man holding a photo, a nation holding its breath. Then one small nod, barely visible, the kind we give when we are finally ready to learn. And so this story closes, not with the sound of a gavel, but with the echo of a father's love that refused to be silenced. It reminds us that justice is more than punishment, and mercy is more than weakness. It is the bridge that keeps our humanity alive. If this story touched you, if it made you pause and see the world with new eyes, I invite you to stand with us. Give this video a like so more people can hear it, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Norah Stories. Together, we can keep telling the stories that matter, the stories that shine a light on truth, on justice, and on the hope that change is always possible.